Welcome to Dusty Little Wastelanders, written by L.L. Smith, narrated by L.L. Smith. Chapter 10, Auction. We walked through the graveled trails of McDougal Manor. Even my dusty-ridden boots felt clean against this path paved by tortured labor. We were surrounded by immaculate greenery, a truly impressive feat for the slaves who worked it, not the man who claimed it. Every tree trimmed to the same size and shape as its neighbor, every blade of grass trimmed in unison. This wasted suffering only fueled my hot pot of anger. We made it past the slave station, a housing structure at least 3 times the size of any structure I'd ever been in. I never wanted to even be in the mansion itself. We made it to the far right of the manor where the auction was to be held. A substantial crowd had already gathered around the wagons that were parked against the gates on the right side of the manor. With the amount of care taken for McDougal's precious lawn, I was plumb baffled to see the number of feet traipsing all over it for the sake of this auction. "This is it," TJ announced. "I'll take TM and find a nice place to keep watch." TJ took TM's hand and they disappeared into the crowd. "I'm going to wait around for Donald," K2 announced. "I'm going to scope out the area," I said. "I need to find a place to change discreetly." I took off, leaving K2 to meet with Donald. This manor was huge, but with this many people packed in, it felt more like a single pea crammed in a can. A place to change in private wasn't going to just present itself. At least the places that were off limits were marked clearly by mean-mugging guards. I found the spot, a large tree in the corner of the manor that most people seem to shy away from. If I snuck around that tree to the side that faced the gate, I should be able to avoid detection. I was going to wait until the auction was about half over before changing and waiting. I didn't want to risk premature detection. I could hear a commotion starting up at the entrance. Donald must have made it to the gate. If anyone could weasel their way into the most prestigious auction in Hillville, it was Donald Edmond. I had no clue where TJ and TM had posted up to keep watch, but I trusted they had ample perspective. They had the means to make up some fire bottles, but only as a last resort. K2 was the one I was worried about. He was still very green in regards to, well, anything really. So long as Donald made it into the auction, K2 would be fine. But if K2 was forced to distract the whole crowd on his own, I was confident he'd choke. He was too timid to yell at me. His voice would get lost in the crowd of strangers. I couldn't dwell on K2. We all had our missions, and we had to focus on succeeding. "The entrance is now closed," a voice came booming from the wagons. "Auctioning will start in 5 minutes. Please find your spots. Moving and talking out of turn is frowned upon during the auction," a voice announced. That'd work in my favor. If people weren't going to be moving around, then I didn't have to worry about being spotted. However, once it came time to sneak onto the wagon, I'd be in a pickle. If I were the only person moving, then I'd stick out like a roach in a soup bowl. However Donald and K2 would decide to distract people, they needed to be sure to get the crowd moving. Once again, I can only do so much in terms of controlling the others. I just had to focus on my mission. It took some time to sneak behind that tree, and I sat against his rough trunk to keep my head right. I could make out some of the auction from this point. There were 3 wagons full of slaves, and I had a strong feeling I'd be there for a while. "Please welcome our beloved Mr. Richard McDougal, this auction's gracious host," the announcer announced. I turned my head around to the tree to catch a glimpse of Richard McDougal. He was a moldy muffin, older than Donald even. I'd bet he was in his 50s, kept alive only by his wealth. He was a slim, fit man, judging by how he towered over the balcony, rather tall, too. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back and his black mustache clashed with his skin, which had never seen the sun. He sported some shiny red suit like something worn by a scholar, just not black. It was a man seated beside him that distracted my attention. He was a larger man in a red trench coat with a shiny red pants and shoes. His clothes shined just like K2's. He sported a dirty blonde do with a pointy brown mustache. I'd seen this man before. I dug into my mind. He didn't match my memory of him, but I knew I'd seen him. The poster slapped through town sprang into my mind just as though someone had stuck him right into my brain. I glanced back up to the balcony to confirm. That man was the High Officer Timothy Mowers. What was he doing here, and why wasn't his presence announced? Was his odd garb and changed hair an attempt at a disguise? I turned back. I'd gotten my image and didn't want to risk detection. The auction might prove more educational than I thought, but when this was all over, I wouldn't mind aiming my firing pistol at Mr. McDougal's face and letting one of my killers do its worst. "And now to introduce the Master of Ceremonies, Mr. Ronnie Manilli himself," the announcer ushered in with his hands as another overdressed snake ascended the stage. Ronnie Manilli, just another wealthy waste of skin. The concept that a man could be well renowned for a skill as trivial as auctioning. Perhaps it wasn't a disgust shared by the masses, but it was a disgust that clenched my fists. His red squared suit was stiff with his limbs. It was an odd pattern that I'd never seen before. His wavy brown hair came just above his ears and was clearly cared for. He stepped up to the podium with a projection cone in hand. This man was going to be heard. We'll start the auction off with a gracious donation. Ronnie spoke into his cone. He waved his hand behind him and a couple of guards escorted a child up to his side. The child was an empty vessel, his face void of any childlike wonder. He was dressed as nicely as Mr. McDougal in a dustless navy blue full tux. His hair was done up fresh too. This child was something special, but he sure didn't feel that special based upon his expression. Em has donated yet another one of her beautiful kin to this momentous occasion, the announcer continued. Say hello to Samuel. Samuel is only 7 years old and welcome to any family. Just imagine a son of your very own, minutes of troubles and none of the labor. Ronnie squeezed himself with excitement. 3,000, a voice shouted. 3,000? A starting bid for someone else's kid was 3,000? The gall, these deep pockets. They probably actually thought they could buy a family. And no wonder this child's expression was so empty. He was most likely born for the sole purpose of being auctioned off, expected maybe for a childhood to start after being purchased. But whoever this M was gave him away for free. And now rich people are buying him for $3,000+? What the hell? This had to be the reason for the abduction. People must know what kind of money these deep pockets spend to start a family. No wonder it was such a well-kept secret. The high officer oversaw these auctions himself. If he were pinned to a slave auction, that'd ruin him. Being pinned to this family acquisition auction? I didn't have words proper enough to describe what this was. But it was safe to assume that this all urged the high officer's ruination. He was probably so beat up on having lost his son that he came to these auctions aiming to replace him. I wonder how many children he'd purchased over the years. 3,500, a voice rebutted. 4,500, the original voice called back. There was a silence in the air. The first bidder seemed to have won themselves a Samuel. What the hell was I even saying? The highest bidder had just bought a son? A son, as if he were some sort of can of beans at a grocer. Made me feel a whole new appreciation for the natural affection given by my mother. $4,500 claims the woman in the flower cap, Ronnie claimed. Do any of you wish to counteroffer, Samuel? Ronnie turned to the child. Do you accept this woman in the flower hat as your new mother? Samuel stared blank into the crowd. Of course you do. Ronnie slapped Samuel on the back and shoved him into the crowd. Oh, go meet your mama. All right, let's move on to our first slave of the auction. A burly man came walking up to Ronnie. It must have taken 20 men to get that man in chains. He wore the standard tattered overalls that all the slaves did. His exposed skin was peeling red, and his filthy hair and beard had food tangled in it. Meet the man who we call Oxford. Quite the catch, I must say. Oxford is rumored to lift entire tree trunks, as his massive biceps would look to show off. 300, someone shouted. 300? That was still more money than I'd ever seen in one place. But why was a slave so much cheaper than a child? This was a slave auction, after all. I was expecting bids for this man to start in tens of thousands. 300? I got thinking. If this behemoth went for 300, then I might actually be able to afford Kyle. Wouldn't that be a neat turn? Come here to break him free and wind up buying him and slipping him out easy enough. I sat and listened to the bids with a newfound level of interest. 400, someone shouted. 500, another offer. 600, a quick counter. The scene fell silent once more. 600 sounded like the winning bid. 600 to the man in the straw hat, Ronnie claimed. Come on now, surely someone feels Oxford is worth 700. I mean, look at those muscles. The crowd remained silent. Well, okay then, Oxford, say hello to your new employer. The announcer turned to Oxford, who was being pushed off the stage by the guards. Fuck off! Oxford shouted between shoves. Oh, well, listen to that, Ronnie said. He came free with an attitude, too. Good luck to you, too, Ronnie said with a send-off wave. There were 3 wagons of slaves to be sold before the end of the auction, and I was only now noticing the children mixed in with them all. This auction was sickening. I could imagine all these people had been kidnapped just like Kyle was. That was a frightening enough thought for the adults, but for children, felt like the kind of thing that'd make them go mute. I was predicting this as an all-day affair. I sat behind the tree, rehearsing how I'd sneak onto the wagon closest to me. If I clung to the gate, I might be less of an eyesore, but I had to be quick. There was no telling how long the distraction would last. And then there was the trouble of identifying what my distraction even was. I'd had to trust that I'd know what it was when the time came. Several hours passed, and they'd sold through 2 wagons of folks. Being part of this experience made me loathe humanity. To think this many people openly took part in such a heinous hobby. I say hobby because that's how they presented it.
Hey there, what's up? LL Smith here. Thank you so much for enjoying my audiobook. I'm going to interrupt you real quick and say, if you get real anxious to hear what happens next and just can't wait till next week, or if you get the urge to just support such a stunning, ruggedly handsome, and awesome independent creator such as myself, I encourage you highly to go follow the link in the description and support the official release. Thank you so much for listening, and let's jump right back into that story.
These deep pockets hosted an auction for their wealthy elite friends to buy things. Things. These weren't people, they were things. New things to buy and use until they broke, at which point they'd properly dispose of. Words did not suffice for the level of disgust on my tongue. And that only addressed the slave issue. I hadn't got words suitable for my revulsion toward those who brought a whole new family here. The lady in the flower cap walked away with a 7-year-old Samuel, a 10-year-old Tamara, and a newly born Yusa, all for the reasonable price of $32,300. And she was only one of the many new parents walking away from this auction. "All right," Ronnie called out. "We've sold through half of our stock, and it's time for the entertainment and a light snack." Ronnie twirled his way off the stage. I felt he'd been entertainment enough for one day. I feared what the real entertainment might be. 3 women dressed in baggy clothes rushed the stage. Their gowns flowed with the wind blowing them out like balloons. The women moved strangely on the stage, some sort of dance and some sort of march. Their breezy clothes made their movements hard to follow. Then in unison they turned their attention to the crowd and began throwing things into the crowd. It took my eyes a few moments to follow their violent gestures, but there was no denying it. They were tossing knives at the crowd. The crowd ran around, dodging knives and smacking into each other. There was enough laughter in the air to allude to some level of entertainment, but the entertainment remained all too real with every anguished yelp of those who failed to dodge the incoming blade. Just as the knifers had arrived, their blowing gowns were off the stage and Ronnie was headed back to the center. Now this deep pocket was just showing off. First it was that odd red squared pattern suit, and now he waltzed in with a silk snakeskin vest and matching boots. His pants were burned straight and once more dust-free. Ronnie peered into the crowd with his hand above his eyes, creating a visor from the sun. "How did we do?" He pulled the crowd. Deep Pockets began shouting numbers at the announcer. "I'm hearing a lot of 7s, the man scoffed. "Those ladies' record is 17. Better luck next time, you only got 7 of them. And of the 7, only 3 fatalities. Kind of a bust, I guess." Ronnie shrugged. "But hey, the lady in the flower hat fell to a knife to the throat. I guess we'll need to reclaim her auctional contraband and try again on those kids she won." Samuel, Tamara, and the baby were now being passed up through the crowd and back up to Ronnie. "Had she already paid?" Ronnie turned his attention to Mr. McDougal. Mr. McDougal nodded yes. "What a win! 30,000 and counting." That knife act was the entertainment. I kept my eyes glued to the crowd. They were escorting the injured out my direction. I kept my eyes peeled for a wounded Donald or K2 corpse. Neither showed up, but the idea of such deathly entertainment gripped me. Was having so much money so boring that they had to put their lives in danger for a good time? And the fact that the woman in the flower hat had been killed made the entertainment feel more like an assassination. I wonder how much of her 30,000 Mr. McDougal stuffed in his own pocket, and how much did the entertainment cost? I didn't belong with these deep pockets and was beginning to hope I never came across a lump sum of cash. I had better ways to spend my time than be dodging knives and fleeing bodies. What burned my blood most was watching these children being passed back through the crowd, as if being auctioned off once wasn't bad enough. They now have to face the travesty a second time, and be rebought by a whole new deep pocket. The things I wanted to do in this auction required great restraint. I was only prepared to save Kyle at the moment and needed to stick to that, but this was crime enough to keep me in Hillville long enough to see it all crash. Aside from children 11 and under, I couldn't help but notice the lack of women in this lot. All the labor slaves were men. I reckon the women that were taken were reserved for sex trafficking. Is that what happened to Rita? She certainly wasn't here. I couldn't save her, even if I'd planned to. I have to worry about facing her father empty-handed when the time came, but the real worry was about what she could be facing. Sex trafficking, a crime I assume was handled a little more discreetly. No one in town spoke a word of it, but this upcoming slave auction had been all the talk since I'd gotten here. With the addition of child acquisitions to this auction, I shivered to think what else was being sold at a sex trafficking exchange. Being down to the last cart felt close enough. I chose to change into my disguise. Ragged denim overalls were all I was given. I wore nothing beneath it, exposing plenty of skin, but staying true to my disguise. I ditched my shoes and socks. Such a luxury belonged to that of the working class. Slave labor was somehow not defined as the working class, but as something under it, despite doing all the work for the working class. My discolored knees poked through the holey denims, scarred up bruised patches of tan, red, and purple. My burnt shoulders were exposed to the sun once more. I rustled my hand through my brown hair. It was long enough to dangle just above my eyes. I threw some dust into it and mangled it proper. I hadn't washed my tan, burnt, scarred, and pale face for days in preparation for this. It was plenty discolored and worn enough to serve as a face of an enslaved worker. I could remember checking the mirror before leaving the bar. I didn't recognize my face. This experience had changed my life. Either that, or it was just that Betty was missing. There was a crash in the air, followed by a wail. The commotion jerked my attention. The knifers were back? No. A firing pistol had gone off. I checked my butt pocket. It was still there. The crowd was moving like frightened cattle. This was it, I told myself. I didn't know how, but this was it. It was early, but it had to be it. I ran into the flooding crowd and headed straight for the wagon. I bumped into K2 as I ran through droves of people. Something was wrong. If he had caused a distraction, why was he running too? I paid no mind and kept my forward progression. "Seize them!" a voice called out. I followed its inflection to Richard McDougal, the man standing on the balcony. He stood proud with a rifle in hand, aiming down the sights. He was aiming at the tree I had just come from. Had he seen me? "Chill out, we're coming down," a familiar voice called out from the commotion. Guards just in the distance had crowded around a tree and were prodding at TJ and TM to come down from its branches. I kept sprinting for the wagon. I sprinted right into the clearing with a sea of people. Guards were on top of Donald, holding down his limbs and shoving his face in the pretty grass. There was another crash through the sky. I felt the wind on that one. Good thing that geezer was cross-eyed. 5 guards armed with beating sticks headed straight for me, though. They were onto us. They had to be. I looked to the wagon. It was too far, and we were already busted. I threw my hands in the air and surrendered. The guards paid no mind. They bludgeoned me to the border of consciousness and took me off somewhere. My head cleared up in the library. TM sat in a chair to my left and Donald to my right. They'd whooped Donald just as good as they whooped me. His face looked just as mine felt. Puffy eyes, busted lips, cracked nose. They at least weren't monster enough to harm a child. We were in a library, apprehended but not arrested. We weren't in jail, and our hands and feet remained unbound. I could have turned and run if I wanted to, but that seemed pointless now. More importantly was the lump under my left butt cheek. I still had my firing pistol. Suppose they hadn't bothered to search us. A door behind us opened with a click. Richard McDougal sauntered into what I assumed was his library. His fancy shoes sounded like a lazy tap dancer as he made his approach. He walked around us and sat at the gold desk before us. It was one hell of a librarian's desk. The wood grain was painted a gleaming gold and the trim was lined with real rubies. This man wasted so many precious things. Mr. McDougal leaned against his desk. "What is the reason for this insurrection?" he asked. "How did you find us?" I smelled betrayal. "I spotted TJ and that child in one of my trees pretty early on. I spotted you in my peripheral vision when you spotted me from behind that tree. From there I hunched that the man who caused the scene at the gate was probably part of this motley crew too. You know TJ? I knew I'd been double-crossed." "Don't fret, he didn't sell you out," Mr. McDougal said with a casual wave. "He and his affiliates practically operate in my backyard. You really think I didn't know about them? Who do you think provides their greenleaf? They're just a bunch of escapists itching for the next high, whether it come from the thrill of life or the end of a pipe," Mr. McDougal stated. "I mean, it's a rather laughable matter that you consented to this plan. This plan came from a man who thought that climbing up a tree was an inconspicuous place to hide." "It's okay to laugh. It serves as proof that you've grown past your mistakes." He stood up straight. "I've answered your question quite thoroughly. Now it's your turn. The insurrection. Why did it happen?" "Your slave trader freaks kidnapped my brother and looked to sell him in this sick auction." I spat disgust his way, along with a little blood from my broken face for good measure. "Those fools are only supposed to kidnap people who won't be missed." His eyes became beady as he studied me. "Ah," he announced his epiphany. "I know your brother. I see the resemblance now. If your hair were blonde, it'd be perfect. Kyle Duke?" The name brought stingers down my spine. "That is your brother, isn't it?" Mr. McDougal ascertained. "Yes," I agreed. You're really going to hate this, but all this nonsense was for naught." My heart sunk as I waited for the end of this sentence. Ever since hearing his name, it had been like I was hearing this conversation in reduced time. "Kyle was delivered to me about a week ago. I bought him through my private port on the back of the property." He wasn't dead. My head had leapt to the worst conclusion. I could breathe again, time moved normally, and I could see more clearly. "But, since slave labor is technically illegal and you've presented this issue to me, I can't just ignore it," Mr. McDougal stated. "You're gonna kill us?" I accused. "So no one will miss Kyle?" "I'm afraid you've confused me with some common thug." Mr. McDougal's words were loaded with offense. "You had no problem shooting at me at the auction." "I was a decorated marksman in my youth. If I were aiming at you, that's where my killer would have reached." Mr. McDougal leaned back into his chair. I could tell it was story time. "There isn't much value for human life around here. I reckon it was in the war that I realized that. People openly counted their bodies and compared their scores accordingly. It was rather sick." Mr. McDougal's tongue slithered. "It is those very beliefs, and my lack thereof, that separates me from those savages." "You work your slaves to death, and host auctions where people are sold," I accused. "How does that differ from murder and body counting?" "I don't kill slaves," Mr. McDougal defended his beliefs. "They die from their own weakness. I feed and shelter all of my slaves, which is a great deal more than what most wastelanders have." "So the slave trade targets wastelanders?" I asked. "It always has," Mr. McDougal said with a smug grin. "Look, I need to address what happened at my auction with my associates, so I need to wrap this up. I'll give you 3 methods by which you can reclaim Kyle." Mr. McDougal pulled out a sheet of paper and pulled out a pen from the inkwell on his desk. "First," he said, "I will write a contract stating that Kyle will be free once he's paid back in labor the money I loaned him. I paid $780 for him, and I'm using that as the loaned amount. Once he pays back the $780 through labor, he'll be free to go. Paying off that debt through labor will take about 3 years. Second," he continued, "is simply to pay him back for what I paid for Kyle. Based on your financial status, I'm willing to bet you haven't got $780 to throw around, though. Third," he concluded, "is a simple trade. Give me that child," he pointed to TM, "and I'll give you Kyle." I froze. What an ideal proposition. TM for Kyle, a problem for family, a dead giveaway. It at least should have been. I felt filthy considering this trade. We'd fought off our fair share of abductions, but now I sat here willing to hand him over. I'd never solved the mysteries behind his drawings. Mr. McDougal didn't realize the baggage he'd be receiving. Perhaps he didn't care. McDougal probably planned on selling TM over to High Officer Timothy Mowers anyway. I was a fool to think this was anything short of that. But after this, if I managed to scare off Donald, it could just be Kyle and I, just family. And that was all that ever mattered. I'd never wanted these extras. Kyle was sweet on them, but they just dragged me down. All these other people I'd be. My mind froze. Where would I be without them? Honestly. These extra people as I'd labeled them in my mind. Without them, I'd never have found the courage to look for Kyle. I'd never even found his tracks in the wasteland, never spotted the thug's signal fire, never made it through the registration tent in Hillville, and never forged passes to get in the auction to even have this opportunity. I owed that all to them. Here I was, the fox, with one leg in a trap. I could sever the leg and be on my way, alone. Or I could trust my pack and carry on with a wound. Kyle would never forgive me for trading TM, and I'd have to go through a whole nother rescue mission. Fuck that. No deal, I stated. The amount of time it took me to think over the decision had alarmed both Donald and TM, and rightfully so. They expected immediate loyalty, and I'd failed, but I'd made the right choice, and that had to be enough. And I don't have enough money to buy him back either, I sulked. I must say I'm surprised, Mr. McDougal bragged. Your character is uncompromised. That was a hot deal, and they may feel a certain way based on how long it took you to make your decision, but that wasn't their decision to weigh down on their mind. It's all too easy to judge from the outside. He poked his finger at Donald and TM. I like you, kid, and I like Kyle, too. Unfortunately, I am a businessman. I didn't build my $1,000,000 empire by throwing money away. I will be glad to entertain your presence once more when you've made $780 or 3 years from now, whichever comes first. Mr. McDougal dismissed us with a wave, and the doors to the library opened, suggesting our exit. I passed through the doors a defeated man. I tried to tap into Kyle's outlook once more, find some good in Mr. McDougal's character. All that came to mind was the fact that he hadn't killed us. But traces of good couldn't hope to redeem his deeds. End of Chapter 10.